Here we go. Are you ready? It's going to be good. You ready? It's going to be wonderful. I've got a little bit of a problem because I've been doing these sermons, so they're kind of offbeat Bible stories, things we don't talk about a lot. And so what happens is I begin to look through, okay, now what should I be saying? And so what ends up happening is I want to end up preaching an entire Bible book to you at a time, and that doesn't work really well when your bottom gets tired after a little while. And so anyway, so I tried really hard to keep these within a reasonable amount of time, but if it isn't working right, around here we blame everything on Karen, and so it'll be her fault. She admits it. You have to be really, she'll attest, you have to be really careful if you are signing a job description around here that says other duties as assigned. So that column is full, but first thing is take blame for everything. So anyway. According to one website that I happen to be reading, an obituary is like a miniature funeral. I was thinking about this statement, and I'm like, The idea being that, not everybody can make it to the actual funeral, and so it's kind of this little kind of condensed version so that you kind of get the gist of what the person's life was maybe all about. This same website talks about 6 elements of an obituary. I'm going to go through 4 of the essential ones, and I'll give you the other 2, but I'm not going to talk about them quite as much. But the first thing that's absolutely essential in an obituary is that there needs to be an announcement of death, or it's not an obituary. Seems kind of obvious, right? So I was reading through, and it talks about, now sometimes when you're reading through the obituaries. Now, I don't read through the obituaries that often, but every so often I'll just kind of take a quick glance, make sure I'm not in there. But the reality is that you look through, and sometimes you'll see somebody younger, or somebody who like, why is this person dying at age 20 or at age 30? And you want to know what's the story behind the story. And sometimes they say that it's good to put, if it's sudden or whatever, it's good to put the cause of death in there because it saves you from having to keep explaining it over and over and over again. And sometimes, if you want to be more private, it's really nobody's business what your family member died of, so it's okay to leave it out. And so I thought, okay, well, announcement of death is how you start an obituary. And that's kind of an important thing. The second thing is a biographical sketch. And according to the website, you have to be really careful to only put in the defining facts of your life, or of one's life, but it's the defining facts. So if you were reading your own obituary, it's really the idea of what are the things that make you who you are, as opposed to just make you like everyone else in the whole wide world, right? So what are these things? What do you like that maybe makes you special, or what are some of the things that you have done in your life that are noteworthy or whatever else? So there's some defining facts in there. That's really important. The third thing is family. And the website noted that this is the area where you are most likely to offend. Because particularly in today's world where there are so many different sorts of blended families and whatever else, you're bound to not get something quite right. And so one of the things they say is that if you are someone who knows that your death is somewhat imminent, it's good to have a little folder somewhere that kind of sketches your own obituary so that you can have it in there the way you have it and the facts are right. Because otherwise, what happens is everybody around you is sad that you're gone. And then they may forget somebody who's really important, like your sister or your brother or one of your kids or one of your stepkids or one of your dogs, I don't know. So family is really important. When you're doing an obituary, service times are kind of key. Now it's sort of a miniature funeral, but people may actually want to come to the actual one and see, it's almost like the preview. Here's what you're going to hear about, now come hear about it at this time, at this place. The other 2 things are special messages. Now, a special message is something like you could say, well, thank you to the staff at the hospital or the nursing home or whatever else. And the other thing that could really, be beneficial is if you hey, donations could be made to the person's favorite charity or to the cancer research or whatever else. And then finally, photos can make an obituary quite special. And I thought this was sort of interesting because they point out that if you want to use a younger photo of the person and the person's a bit older, that you should also include one of their older photos because people won't actually recognize them. And so if they're looking through and go, well, now that really young person right there is not the old geezer that I know. Hey, it's what it said in the website. I'm not just making this up. And so anyway, there you go. Obituaries are about remembrance. Just like funerals, or we like to call them a lot of times memorial services or celebration of life. The idea is to remember, and that's something that I think is really quite important. And so you might have noticed there's one particular obituary that's been kind of going around on Facebook lately and in the news that was kind of viral. And the newspaper printed this particular obituary. And then as soon as they had printed it, they got complaints and took it off their website and everything else. But that was, after there was already pictures and stuff of it. So you might remember this lady who, it says that she was born. And it kind of goes through some of those things. They don't get to the fact that it's actually a death until the end, but of course we know what it is. She marries the fellow, has a couple of children, and then runs off with the husband's brother. You might notice in there it says that she abandoned her kids when she went to California, and then they were raised by her parents, and then she died. And that last paragraph there, my kids do this to me. I'll be dead and won't know, but she will now face judgment. And she will not be missed by her kids because they know that the world is a better place without her. Not really sure what to make of that. This next one actually was a bit of a joke. It was done by the request of the lady who passed away, but it starts off with "Ding dong, the witch is dead. But the memory of our mother lives on." And so you have sort of this idea of, what is it going to be? And they say that the story behind this is that she had actually asked that be put into her obituary, and they were actually following what she had requested. And so there you go. I think most people would like to be remembered for bringing joy and inspiration to others. If something were to happen to me tonight and you guys were gathered here tomorrow for a memorial service, I hope that you would say, "Oh, he brought joy and inspiration." Not, "Oh, I'm so excited. The sermons are going to be so much better now. But I will miss my Sunday morning naps." I think that's how we would like to be remembered, right? That we were happy people, that we were wonderful people. I think most of the time we want to know that we made a difference in the lives of others. I don't necessarily want he was like Billy Graham. Touch lives all over No, I don't really care about that. I just put that out. But I want to know that I made a difference in somebody's life. And that's important, right? And so I think that's how we want to be remembered. And I think that's where obituaries sometimes come in. Some people see this sort of thing as legacy. You know what legacy is, right? In its purest sense, legacy is what we pass on to others. If you go get a dictionary and look at legacy, one of the things is a legacy is the money and things you pass on when you die. That's your legacy. But it also is other things. And so when we think of what are we passing on, I don't know that most of us are that concerned about passing on money or things. I think we're more concerned about what are some of the other sorts of things that we're passing on. You see, the reality is that all of us, and if this is news to you, I'm really sorry to break it to you. It's Sunday morning. You're going to die. I don't know when, I don't know how. It's going to happen. Okay. What will your legacy be? Will it be like the one obituary I showed you, that first one? That's not the kind of legacy most of us want to leave, but it's what we pass on to others. My question is, how are faith and legacy connected? You see, here we are, we find ourselves in church, and we know that faith is really important, but we also have this sense that we need to have a legacy, and that this legacy needs to be something that we're really paying close attention to. And so part of what my curiosity is that how does faith and legacy kind of work together? So here we are looking at offbeat Bible stories, and if you really think about it, down in its truest form, every story that we've gone through so far talks about the legacy of a particular character in the Bible, of how God used them or how God affected them. I mean, that's really honestly what we're looking at. And what sorts of things are they? So today we find ourselves in the story of Hosea and Gomer. It's kind of an offbeat story. Some of you may be a little more familiar with this story than some of the other ones that we've kind of gone through, but if you're not, it's quite entertaining. You'll enjoy it. We do have a lot of scripture to read through today, but here we go. Are you ready? When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go and marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her." By the way, really, the word is have promiscuous children with her. "For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So he married Gomer, who apparently was very promiscuous, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, "Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel." Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, "Call her Lo-Ruhamah," which means not loved or not favored, a bunch of things. "For I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses or horsemen, but I, the Lord their God, will save them." After she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, "Call him Lo-Ammi," which means not my people. "For you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' they will be called children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together. They will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel." Kind of an interesting story. Here's the thing. Hosea's message, and really the message comes through as much in his life as it does in what he says, but it's a story of unfaithfulness and rejection of God. Not necessarily on Hosea's part, but on Israel's part. Now, if we remember our history, Israel should be so in love with God, because why? He has redeemed them out of Egypt, taken them into the promised land, said, "You are going to be my people. I'm going to favor you. This is going to be awesome. You're going to love it." And they get there and they're pretty excited until they forget why they're there. And by the time Hosea comes around, basically they're asleep at the wheel. So God is basically saying through Hosea, "Look, Israel, look at the problem that you have created. This story is a story of unfaithfulness. It's a story of rejection of God, and it's really the story of Israel's unfaithfulness and rejection." It's important for us to get that. You see, Hosea ends up speaking to Israel, but if you notice, the words are not so much. One of my problems, and I know this as a parent, And one of my problems is that when I go to correct my kids, I use too many words. That whole lecture thing that we tend to do as parents. Anybody else guilty of that? Yeah, okay. Thank you for making sure I'm not the only one in there that does that. But too often I want to over-explain why I'm upset. Instead of just saying, look, this is why, real quick, fix it. One of the things we get particularly in chapter 1, is that prostitution is a metaphor. It's a symbol of constant infidelity between Israel and Yahweh. So basically, what God is saying through Hosea is that prostitution is sort of this example of what's going on between Israel and God himself. That essentially Israel has become a prostitute that just kind of goes out looking for pleasure, looking for a quick buck, looking for something else, but not really being pure and faithful to God. And so you have this metaphor, and this sort of runs into some problems with exactly what it is. So when God says, go out there and find yourself a prostitute or a promiscuous woman, it's not so much that he's really looking for somebody who is in that profession. The definite impression that you get is that he's looking for a trait. That essentially, that if this is a metaphor, that what he's trying to do is get Hosea to go out and find someone who's just not that sure to be faithful. It's an interesting thing to be told by God, go find yourself a promiscuous wife. Anybody really excited about that? I don't know what I would do if God said something like this, because it doesn't even sound like God. Anybody kind of uncomfortable with God going, hey, go find yourself a prostitute, marry her? Kind of crazy, right? Hosea is to have children of prostitution. You see, the thing is that what God is doing here is saying, look, you're going to marry a promiscuous wife, and then you're going to have this promiscuous or prostitute kids. It's not so much that the kids aren't Hosea's, although there are some scholars that would argue that. But the issue is that they become part of the example that Hosea is trying to show to the world, to Israel in particular. And so you have this promiscuous woman who has these kids who are sort of this product of the unfaithfulness and a symbol of the faithlessness of Israel itself. That's why they end up with these wonderful names, right? The first child, named Jezreel, represents judgment. You get this first kid, and it's a boy, which is perfect. Boys were what you wanted as your firstborn, and so right off the bat, Hosea gets exactly what he needs, and God sort of comes to him and says, all right, here's the name you are to give him. Here's the name he is to have, and goes on this thing that it's going to represent Jehu and Jezreel and the massacre. And your first thought when you read that is that if it's about judgment, then that massacre at Jezreel must have been a sinful event. If God is saying, because of this, you name him this, and I'm going to destroy Israel. And yet, when you really look back at history, God had called them to do this. You end up with a couple of kings. I'm forgetting the first one, but Zechariah being another one. But you have about a 6-month reign, and they go in there and they take care of it. But it's not so much the idea that they went in and had the massacre. That's not really the big deal. You see, Jehu would have been following God's orders when the massacre had happened. So at the time, God would have been pleased. He was doing what he was supposed to do. So what then is the big problem? Why now are we naming some poor kid after this and saying, by the way, you represent the judgment of Israel? You want to talk about giving your kids some issues, right? What's the big deal? I mean, if he's explaining to his son, this is why you're named this and this is what God is going to do. What's he explaining? I think what the issue really is that there's a lot happening since the massacre. That essentially what Jezreel is supposed to represent, what that event, that massacre is supposed to represent is sort of a purification. And instead of the purification, what you have instead is basically Israel going out and prostituting itself. And so now God is saying, look, you have gone away from the faithfulness and you've gone into a faithlessness. You've gone away from me. And so God is saying, all right, it's time for judgment. So this poor little kid who's part of this family now gets that wonderful name. I think it's important that we understand this, that God has declared it so. Verse 4 talks about Israel becoming destroyed. Israel is going to be demised. Judgment has been declared. Now my guess is that if Israel would shape up and go, oh my goodness, now that we have this piece of information, we need to get back on track with God, that there is no judgment needed. But as always, we sometimes get warned and we go, oh, that's okay. No big deal. And then God has to do what God has to do. You see, the child represents the destruction. Israel's prostitution, though, is going to lead to yet another unfortunately named child. You remember the second one, right? The second child represents a lack of compassion for Israel. The NIV talks about that no love, no compassion. It's another way to look at that, or a lack of compassion. Another way to look at that is unpitied. There's no sympathy for this group of people. So now you have poor Hosea having to marry a prostitute. The prostitute represents Israel's unfaithfulness. She has her first kid who was representing judgment. Now this next one is representing the fact that God is basically saying, I will no longer take pity on you, my people. I'm done forgiving you. It's over. That's essentially what he's saying. I want to make sure we get this, that this is not an action that the daughter takes. A lot of times back then, the kid gets a name, not like on the day that they're born. Like we go, oh, look, I've had the name picked out for this child since 6 months ago, and this is the name of the new child. Normally, they would be named later when you kind of find a name that matches their personality, which I think would be scary in today's world. Just throw that out. Oh, such a cute baby. What will we name him? He who spits up a lot? I don't know. But it's this name that gets put upon her. In a world where normally your name represents more of your personality. So when he says, hey, this is one with no compassion, or this one is called no compassion, as a reminder to Israel of what's coming. It's done to her, not because she has no compassion. I want to make sure we're clear on that. She's named this because Israel, again, is no longer going to be tolerated. It's no longer going to be forgiven for its sin. You see, I think one of the problems is we want to take advantage, full advantage of God's grace. I think Israel fell into this too. Paul kind of talks about this, and I won't go too far into this, but I think one of our problems is we think, oh, God loves us. I mean, did you happen to notice God redeemed his people up out of Egypt in miraculous ways? It's incredible what he did. So he'll just keep forgiving sins. We're in the promised land anyway, right? It's going to be wonderful. Woohoo! And then God says, look, I can't keep tolerating this. It's not something I can do. One of the things that scholars kind of struggle with is this idea that lack of compassion is not legitimate, or no compassion. This child is maybe not Hosea's. Whether or not that's true or not, no one will fully know, but here's part of what they're saying. You know, if you think of no compassion or no love and not favored, it could be a product of infidelity. It could be that she is not very well liked or whatever because she is not Hosea's. Whether that's true or not is not really all that important to the gist of the story. The third child is going to represent separation. I'm not sure how I would like it if my kids or I had been named not my people. Get over here, not my people. If I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. Right? This kid's going to need therapy, right? When we stop and we think about the fact that God is declaring Israel is no longer his people. There's going to be judgment. There's no more forgiveness and compassion at this point because the people will not turn back to God. They're too busy prostituting themselves. So now he's saying, look, I'm not going to continue this any further. I'm not going to tolerate your unfaithfulness to me. I think God still thinks this way, y'all. Israel's fate being announced with Jezreel. Israel's condition being announced with the birth of no compassion or no favor or no love. And Israel's status is now announced with not my people. And Israel, by its very nature, was God's nation. And now God says, look, at least for a time being, watch this. You are not my people. Why? Because you're stuck in this prostitution. You're stuck in this habit. In the end, ultimately, Hosea's family serves to represent the broken covenant. We've talked a little bit about the idea of covenant. It's a promise that God makes and a promise that we make. And God is excellent. He's outstanding at upholding his end of the promise. We are not so good. We're still not always all that good. We make promises to God, and sometimes we find ourselves in places where we are not doing what we say to God we will do. Oh, when we first make the promise, we're pretty good at it. In fact, I'd say we're excellent at it when we very first start. And then it goes downhill. Because the reality is we get used to God just being who God is. See, the issue here is that the results of a broken covenant are felt in real time. Israel's going to suffer. There's going to be judgment. There's going to be a lack of favor for God's people. Why? Because they're no longer his people, at least for a period of time. We talked a little bit last week about this idea that there can be these 40 days, which is basically enough time for a new generation. And so essentially, there's probably going to be a generation that's pulled out. And we know that this is before the big exile in 587. And so when you think about that and think about what God does to try to bring Israel back, he ends up having to exile them. In the midst of all of this, there's still hope for a future. You caught verses 10 and 11, right? Even if Israel is initially unrepentant and remains unfaithful, God says there's going to come a time when everything's going to be restored. Everything is going to be okay in the end. Once again, by the time we're done, Israel will have me as their Lord. That's what God says to them. And that's important for us to keep track of. But of course, that's also not the end of the part of the story I wanted to share with you today. We're going to go back to chapter 3. Now, chapter 2 kind of talks a little bit about the judgment and comes up with some promises again. Doesn't really say a whole lot about Hosea and Gomer. But picks back up here in verse 3 when Hosea says, "The Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes." For those of you that are wondering, sacred raisin cakes you shouldn't love. That's basically saying I like the ritual of another god. Okay? Because they taste good. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way towards you. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days. The message actually becomes a message of God's love. Chapter 1, it's all about the prostitute. The prostitute is Israel, really. The children are the judgment, the sort of here's what's going to happen and representing that. And now we turn to God's love. When you read that first verse of chapter 3, you'll find that Hosea is to love 4 separate times in one little verse. Show love to your wife. Love, 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 love. 4 different times where you have that verb. God's love, by the way, is this covenant love. It's this love that loves you no matter what, even in the midst of your worst moments, in contrast to Israel's selfish, indulgent, and pleasure-seeking love. Here's the thing that really gets me about this whole thing. Not a lot has changed since the days of Israel. I'm concerned that too many in the church today say, I want to enter this covenant love with God. I want to hear and I want to feel Jesus' love because of what he did for me. And I will love God back. But we put a little asterisk right there. Not intentionally, I just think it's what we do. The little asterisk says this, until times get tough. Or until it's no longer convenient. And then we'll go back to Israel's type of love. Israel's covenant love says, hey, look, I'll love you so long as it benefits me. I'll love you so long as everything is perfect in my world and I get to eat all the wonderful raisin cakes. Yuck, I don't like raisins. And pleasure seeking. I'm worried we do this. One of the things about this chapter is we tend to assume that the wife is Gomer. If we're talking about the wife in the beginning of the book, and the wife is Gomer, and it says, go find yourself a promiscuous woman, and in some versions it actually says, go find a prostitute. If you really want to have a lot of fun, go back and read the King James versions where it talks about find a woman from whoredom. Some colorful language for you. We tend to think, all right, now it says, depending on what version you're reading, it says something to the effect of, the Lord says to Hosea, go love your wife again. Some say he says to Hosea again, go love your wife. How you read that and where you put the word can matter, but if Gomer is the wife, what happened that she now finds herself essentially in slavery as a prostitute? It makes you wonder, right? We don't know how much time has passed since good old Not My People was born and this occurs. But what we do know is that if it's Gomer and if she is gone off to become a prostitute, that essentially leaves Hosea to be a single dad. I mean, think about it. Mom's off sleeping in different bedrooms. She's run off, and so Hosea's having to raise these 3 children on his own. And I'm guessing that they're wondering. I think it's a little bit of the reverse of that one obituary. It might be that those wonderfully named, unique kids might have put an obituary in the Israelite Times that said, our mom left us to be a prostitute because she was a promiscuous woman. And the world is a better place now that she's no longer promiscuous. Not really sure what this means, but Gomer has to go purchase this wife. One of the things that we note here in chapter 3 is that the idea of a prostitute is no longer a metaphor. If in the first one it's more of the traits, this idea of a promiscuous woman, go find somebody who maybe could be a prostitute. Somebody who probably would be willing to sleep around because that's what we're trying to show. Now, The Lord is being a little more specific. You need to marry someone who is actually a prostitute. I don't know how I would feel if God came to me and said, now go find yourself a prostitute, someone who's an adulterer, someone who's unfaithful, and commit to that person. Anyone want to sign up for that? We know that there's a lot of issues with this, right? That it would be a real challenge. I got to tell you this, whether or not it's Gomer we're talking about, the marriage is representatives of what God is going to do for Israel. That essentially what Hosea has to do is go find a prostitute and essentially redeem her by giving her a stable place. And despite all of the craziness, to show the love. God is going to do that for Israel, who's essentially prostituted herself. Essentially walked away. Hosea makes payment and therefore owns his wife. Now we got to remember that this is in a little different society today. Now I will occasionally tell you that I have papers that say that my wife belongs to me. We went and we got a license. One of our last names changed and it wasn't mine. So my joke is, I have papers. I know she really loves that, and anyway. This is the part where she wouldn't let me get away with this, but the payment described was 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley, however much that should happen to be. Carissa's mother did ask for something like a dozen white rats, but I don't think I ever paid that. When you think of this idea of she's in slavery, and this is about the amount of money that a slave would probably get, and it's probably a little below average, so not even the perfect thing. But now that he owns her, Hosea may impose rules upon her. But she's property. Here's what you must do. Here's what you must act like. Here's what you must keep yourself pure and whatever else. And so he provides 4 instructions for her. The first one is that she is going to be living with Hosea for many days. And here's where that becomes sort of a unique kind of thing. And what he's telling her is also what God is essentially telling Israel. You see, when you redeem a slave or when you purchase a slave, you're going to keep that slave, but as property, you're only going to keep that slave for as long as it's useful to you. So when Hosea says, look, you're going to be living with me for many days, what he's saying is I am committed to you pretty much until you die. Not until your usefulness has gone off or until I want to make a few extra bucks and so I might sell you for profit. But you are stuck with me. I am making a commitment to you. You should expect to sit down and stick around for a while, just like Israel ought to expect that God isn't going to let go very quickly. Second, he says there's to be no prostitution, no more sleeping around with other men who are married. Her sinful life is over. God has redeemed it. God has said, look, this is the way things ought to be. Number 3, there are to be no sexual relations with any man. So you're not to be going out and prostituting yourself. I didn't buy you to make money off you in this way. You see some of the interrelations with Israel. Stop doing these other things. And number 4, there are to be no sexual relations with Hosea. Not only does he redeem her, but they will both remain pure. This is the way they will treat each other. Something to notice is that these rules are actually protections. What Hosea is doing is he's laying out some rules that will protect his wife, that will protect this. It's part of Hosea showing love to her. There's a reason why I use so many words when I'm lecturing my kids. It's because I want to protect them. And I think if I talk a lot, they'll stop doing whatever it is that they're doing. No matter how many times they roll their eyes or try to walk away. Thought just occurred to me a week or so ago that the first one's going to turn 13 next month, and then they'll be in very quick succession after that. And I'm currently taking applications if you'd like a teenager to live with you for a while. The rules are actually protections. God is using Hosea as this example of Israel, that they're going to be the prostitute that is brought back from sin, that they're going to be the ones who God says, here's the way you are to live, and that he's going to say, look, you're going to be with me for a long time, but we need to keep this relationship pure. If I'm going to keep my end of the covenant, you got to keep your end of the covenant. That's the way this works. You see, the entire story that we've read so far is about how God is going to punish, but he's also going to restore Israel. He's punishing or he's disciplining or whatever word you want to put in there. But what he's doing is he's saying, look, Israel, you've got to come back to me, and then we'll be in the status you want us to be in. You see, all of this is an effort to bring his people back to him, to show them what they're supposed to be living like, to show them what it looks like when they've gotten out of it. And so what God is essentially saying is he wants sin to be out of the picture. And by the way, if you didn't know this, he still does want sin out of the picture. I'm convinced of that. How are faith and legacy connected? The risk of sounding a little oversimplified. Our faith is based on our willingness to obey God. If God says this is how you live in relationship with me, a big part of our faith is how willing we are to say, God, no matter what you ask, I will obey. No matter where you want me to go, I will follow. Ask me to marry a prostitute, that's what I'll do. You hear what I'm saying, right? See, this faith is all about a willing obedience. God makes demands on us all the time. He says, look, in our covenant, here's what I want you to do. And every time we go, okay, well, does this make sense? Do I want to do this? Is this something that I think should happen? Do we do it or not? How far are you willing to go to obey God? Here's my problem. I really do think that a lot of us have drawn some lines in the sand. And when God says, hey, this is what I want you to do, we'll walk as close as we can get to that line, but once we reach that line in the sand, we stop. And we go, Lord, please don't let me go over that line. Stop asking. And God says, nope, I want you to step over the line and really give yourself to me. And we're like, oh no, I want to stand over here. Lord, how far are we willing to go to obey God? The problem is that I think we are sometimes too afraid of what God might ask us. That if we cross this line and go, okay, Lord, I've taken the step of faith, and now I'm really excited. Let's see where you take me on this. Well, one of our biggest fears about saying yes to this is that God's going to say, okay, now try this. And then he's going to say, okay, now try this. And then pretty soon, we're way out on a limb. Anyone kind of afraid of heights? I think sometimes God says, take another step out on the high wire. I've got you. Take another step out on the high wire. I've got you. Take another step on the high wire. I've got you. And we go, Lord, you're really putting me in some danger here. If I happen to look down, and I've been telling myself not to, but if I happen to look down, I'm going to be really fearful, and then I will fall and I will die. And we forget the fact that God said, take another step because I've got you. I wouldn't tell you to take another step if I don't have you. That's part of his covenant with us. We get too afraid of what he might ask. Now, do you hear the warning of Hosea? Are you hearing what's being said? Are you hearing what Jezreel's all about? This fact that the judgment is coming. And by the way, that's still true. A judgment is coming. How about this idea of no compassion? Well, I don't know that I really think that that's still true. God shows us love, and he still wants us to be his people. But do you hear the danger of essentially prostituting our faith and kind of falling in line with other gods, which usually are us? I think part of our problem is that we tend to join Israel in its infidelity rather than live against what they've showed us how not to do it. We got to be careful. I think our legacy is determined by the strength of our faith. If you think of legacy as what we pass on to the next generation, I think what we pass on to the next generation, and the only thing that matters is how faithful were we. Are we doing what we are supposed to be doing in order to show the next generations and the people who come behind us and the people who are not yet Christians what it looks like to live in a faithful relationship with God? If Israel had a legacy at the time of Hosea, what legacy did they have? Essentially, their legacy would be, the thing they pass on would be, you know what? You can have everything that you could have ever imagined. You could have had God, you could have the land flowing with milk and honey, and you could have God as your king, and you could have God's blessings and favor and everything else if you will just hold up your side of the bargain. And the legacy, the thing they're passing on, is actually not that at all. Their legacy is you can throw all that away by just not paying attention. And I'm worried we do the same thing. If you had to stop and think about your faith right now, what legacy would you be passing on? If someone is watching you and they're seeing how you live out your faith, what legacy are you going to pass on to the next generation or the people who come after you? Someone who maybe is watching you and saying, what does this Christian life look like? Is it real to you? I'm a little worried that in today's church, one of the legacies that we're passing on is that these churches are wonderful places to come, to gather, to essentially be part of a club. But in the end, they don't really mean much. Pray that that's not our legacy. I hope we're fighting against that. If legacy is what we pass on to future generations, then faith is the central role because nothing else is going to last. If you hear legacy, and in the world a lot of legacy is here's the money and houses and stuff you pass on, well, I got to tell you something. All of that stuff is going to mean nothing at some point. But relationships with Jesus Christ are lasting if we make them. Hosea's book is something like an obituary. How is he remembered? We were going to write a smaller obituary for Hosea. Would it start off with, well, Hosea was born, married a promiscuous wife, and had some promiscuous children. Lived in a time when Israel acted like a prostitute. But listen to what Yahweh had to say and named his children, his unfortunate children's names, because God told him to. Ultimately was a prophet who was maybe not listened to as well back then, but could be listened to really well today. His legacy would still be true now. Hopefully, he would not be remembered just as the guy who married a prostitute, although I think that's how most of us will remember. Would we remember that he was simply called to love promiscuous women? I don't know. How would you want your obituary to read? It's a thing called an autobituary. You know what that is? It's when you write your own. You thought about what yours would say if you had to write your own? Would you be brutally honest with yourself? If it was just about faith, what would it say? Here's the life of who actually followed Jesus the very best they could. I mean, that's what I want to say. That's what I think I could say most of the time. Maybe. What would we say? I hope that it would say redeemed, obedient, faithful to God, loving, hopeful, trying to leave the world a better place, not because of money or possessions, but because we have access to a God who makes the biggest difference in life that you could ever imagine. Question that I hope we leave with is your legacy in God? Or are you counting on something else for your legacy today? Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word. Lord, no matter how hard it is to recognize that we are a people who so easily wander from what you want us to do, that you call us back time and time and time again. Lord, I just ask that you would guide us, that you would direct us, that you would help us to see that our legacy is so important, and that the only legacy that matters is that what we leave in faith. If we really think about that, Lord, that should challenge us to share our faith with everyone. It should challenge us to make sure our faith is as good as it should be. It should turn us into the holiness people that you've called us to be, that are constantly looking to rid sin out of our lives, root it out and get rid of it. And that we would live a pure and holy life where you can peacefully coexist. Help us to hold up our end of the covenant, knowing that you are so faithful in yours. Lord, we just ask that you would guide, direct, keep these thoughts in our minds throughout this coming week, that we would become more like you. We pray all of this in the most wonderful name we know. In the name of Jesus, all God's people said.